Más 46.
Muy buenos días. En representación.
Good morning. On behalf of the coordinating team of audit on governance structures for the integral management of mining environmental liabilities, the Public Works Working Group of OLACEFS, the Department of Environment, Public Works and Enterprises, and Cooperation and International Relations Unit of the Office of the Comptroller General of Chile, welcomes you to this opening session of the Results Consolidation Workshop on this audit. Today and over the course of the next 3 days, the auditing teams from the 12 Supreme Auditing Institutions and 2 subnational entities will meet seeking to overcome the limitations imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic to share our results and offer a regional view of the issue. In addition, both today and on Friday, our audience includes auditors from OLACEFS, the Working Group on Extractive Industries, the Working Group on the Environment, both belong to INTOSAI and other organizations. We thank them for their presence, particularly Ms. Sheila Negra, Mr. Emmanuel Angole, Ms. Maritina Siricuscava, and Ms. Madi Lufono from the Working Group on Extractive Industries of INTOSAI, who have shown special interest and have collaborated actively in this effort. We also thank our other officials for joining us. Please let me note that to use the platform best, please note that on the bottom screen in the control bar, there is a simultaneous interpretation option for English and Spanish, as well as a Q&A section and a comment section where you can receive technical assistance. Please use them actively. At this time, I would like to invite Jorge Bermúdez Soto, Chair of the UN Board of Auditors, Secretary General of OLACEFS, and Comptroller General of the Republic of Chile, as well as a PhD in law and a renowned professor specializing in environmental law, to greet us.
Jaime, si me pueden habilitar el video, por favor, antes de comenzar. Porque no se ve mi pantalla. Está desconectada desde la organización.
Un momento, pedimos disculpas por los problemas
Just
técnicos.
one moment. We seem to have a technical issue, but it is now resolved. Thank you very much, Jaime. Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for participating in this workshop on the consolidation of coordinated audits on the integrated management of mining environmental liabilities by the Spanish acronym PAM. I hope that you are all well in conjunction with your family, surviving this pandemic as best as possible as it has affected our countries and the world. I'd like to recognize our colleagues from OLACEFS, the comptrollers and auditors who are joining us here today for these 3 days of discussion. This coordinated audit falls within the context of a greater effort, which is one that we have undertaken with the very valuable cooperation of JIZ of Germany. That is 12 supreme audit institutions in our region and 2 subnational entities from Latin America and the Caribbean that have been working for over a year on this coordinated audit. Obviously, we have dealt with very severe restrictions and limitations as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has forced us to adapt how we work in an array of areas, particularly those associated with this workshop, to hold it remotely as we are doing here today. But there is also a positive aspect, and that is we've been able to extend these activities both today and on Friday to other colleagues and other professionals from other institutions, and we thank them for their contribution. As such, we will have speakers from the UN Department on Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, as well as a representative of Intesi's WGEI group. We thank you, of course, for your collaboration and presence. This coordinated audit will undoubtedly have an impact on the region and certainly on my home country of Chile, because it lays the foundations for an expansion of oversight of extractive industries and particularly on caring for the environment. There is an approach and a focus that we need to take into consideration, and that is the prism that we are offered through the SDGs. In this context, we are coordinating directly with the implementation of the 2030 agenda for the SDGs, which of course continues to be the roadmap for this region. In addition, the subject matter audited is of the utmost relevance, given the need for our countries to engage in direct actions, given that managing the negative externalities of mining activity also have had a tremendous effect on the region. Therefore, it is important to engage, certainly in mining, of course, but we need to look at the impact on the environment, acidification, soil loss, degradation, and other undesirable effects of mining and their impacts. In this regard, we can see that these are, again, some of the undesirable impacts of mining. But the liabilities are not just associated with the environment, but they also, for decades, have affected human life and health as well. For these reasons, I want to thank everyone who has worked on this audit, particularly for the professionalism the operational approach that has been used even during this particularly challenging times of this audit in the context of the pandemic. Let me also note a few things that are of importance. First, states have the obligation to provide safety and security to their population, and this can be reflected in providing a safe environment for our residents. This should also grapple effectively with the risks to which we are exposed as a result of extractive industries, particularly mining liabilities. Second, we can also see that the audit shows that there is a shortcoming in institutions and appropriate frameworks that allow us to manage these liabilities effectively. The frameworks are long-standing, are ineffective, and are really implemented and used effectively by the institutions associated and required to implement them. Unfortunately, this is something that we can see as a result of the audit. We can also see that there is a silent problem, and that is that environmental liabilities stemming from mining have an impact on thousands of people directly and indirectly. This coordinated audit recognizes the existence of general legal frameworks, which nonetheless to which we can resort, but it also recognizes an inclination toward prevention through the enactment of enforcement of closure laws and environmental assessment of such phases. It also enables us to highlight and recalls the obligations of governments in the protection of people and of the environment. For all of these reasons, and based on all of this evidence, I would like to thank everyone who has participated actively in this coordinated audit. I thank once again GIZ again for supporting us so wholeheartedly and enthusiastically. I hope that this workshop will be an opportunity to draw fruitful conclusions and lessons learned. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Comptroller for these remarks. We are particularly pleased to have you with us here today, and you've of course reaffirmed the importance of having this opportunity. Let me now give the floor to Benjamin Reyes, an auditor and a member of the coordinating team of this audit, who will give us a very brief overview of the work that brings us together and that what we will be doing in coming days. Let me also remind you that the Q&A section is available and will be available for the current time and into the future. Thank you very much. Benjamin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jaime. If you can confirm that it is visible, please. Yes, it's shared. Thank you. We'd like to greet you, especially the Comptroller who is with us here at this opportunity, and I'd like to thank his words about the work that we're doing. I would also like to thank the speakers panel who have made a huge effort to participate from different parts of the world, and a special thanks to all auditors who are doing very important work within this extremely difficult context, as the Comptroller just mentioned. So the presentation we'd like to offer as an introduction, and also with the objective to explain to the audience the work that will be done, is the following. We wanted to refer to the main aspects of this audit. This began in 2019. We focused on training activities. This has been carried out through different organizations within OLACEFS. We've learned that as auditors, we are constantly learning about the different matters that we audit. And of course, we've had to learn to use different platforms that have been quite useful in closing 2019 and in the first semester of 2020. So within this context, and having had this opportunity for training, we reached the first milestone of this coordinated audit. That was the planning workshop, which was carried out in June 2020. It was originally planned for March, but I'm sure you all know and understand the difficulties we had around the world that month. So the controller had to quickly adapt the methodology, and we promoted and continue to promote this work with a very important focus. The closing of the planning, where we generated agreements and were able to train with the team, and it was a great opportunity. We had the possibility of initiating the audit. This began by means of the local audits carried out by the Supreme Audit institutions that are participating, and we have sought to generate this working group virtually. Fortunately, we were able to do it together with all the participants. So the planning workshop and other training that we had allowed us to design the scope and objectives of the audit. We were able to draw very interesting conclusions that allowed us to organize this work system. And what we audited was the overall management of mining environmental liabilities. So much of this training was very useful. We were able to understand that this management has two main areas. One is preventive management, as was mentioned by the controller, and a corrective management based on the original objectives, which is where we really wanted to focus. We would like to focus on what is being done today with this highly polluting structure and how it's affecting the different areas and their populations, and how this is being done. Therefore, based on the results that we have with the Supreme Audit institutions, we knew that we had to focus in the first place on this governance structure, and that is how we began to analyze the regulatory frameworks that we could eventually refer to demand this participation. We also focused on finding the right elements. There are elements that were being applied, and also including citizen participation. We know that that is of the utmost importance in any process carried out in our states. And then in terms of corrective actions, I'm going to refer to the core element and most important in audits, which is the tools that have been designed to standardize and generate risk assessment. This basically has to do with identifying, prioritizing, and understanding where we're going to guide our resources to make them efficient and to be able to address these polluting sources, of course, with innovation and development, and that it can be used subsequently. And of course, as our controller mentioned, we work very much in line with the SDGs. It's an important part of our work, and understanding the integration there is with the different SDGs. We focused on SDGs 12 and 15, stressing the importance of this instrument and management in all countries. We assessed it basing ourselves on the structures in place. So we wanted to stress this so that you take it into account as you listen to the following presentations. They all follow the guidelines of the 2030 agenda, and the assessment of risk oversight, environmental oversight is very important. So all these things have been taken into account in the assessment. We have shared all this with our audit groups, and it has all been thanks to the local audit institutions. And we gained a lot of experience in doing so. Of course, we try to generate contacts, and fortunately, and thanks to the effort made by all our teams, and that's what was done by the steering committee, we were able to reach this first diagnosis, which was our goal. It was to understand how these mining environmental liabilities were being managed locally, and some preliminary conclusions arose with the coordinated audit. They will be submitted for further discussion in the workshop. That's why we've tried to design activities that follow that direction. And we will refer to this lack of instruments. If the controller, for example, and we can see that here on the graph, how 100% of what is being done, the comprehensive or overall management of mining environmental liabilities, there aren't really that many tools available. This is the regulatory framework axis, and we have regulatory elements that provide the overarching principles for public institutions, and we have sufficient elements to design a good system and to enforce it. We are basically focused on prevention, because that is where we see room for improvement. And you can see in the graph the different elements: citizens' participation, specific regulatory frameworks. And again, the preliminary results are what we wanted to share with you. We basically wish to offer the auditors participating in the workshop some information on how we're going to talk about this very important topic. We also wanted to mention that we would like to consolidate the results from a regional perspective. We believe that this objective takes into account different elements that have been part of OLACEFS work and this coordinated audit. It's important to stress those aspects, and also important is to have the opportunity to discuss and find conclusions, that we be able to recognize the effect and elaborate concrete recommendations that can help transform this scenario that we have identified initially. These are very ambitious objectives, and I'm sure we can achieve them. I would like to thank the authorities again and all the auditors that we will be working with these 4 days. Thank you very much. And back to you, Jaime. Thank you, Benjamin. Benjamin Reyes is an auditor of the Comptroller General's Office of the Republic of Chile. He's a technical coordinator. He just mentioned something that we based this audit on. We specifically referred to the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. It's a commitment that the Supreme Audit institutions have taken on to promote its implementation within the different countries. In order to further elaborate on this, I'd like to offer the floor to Aránzazu, who is going to speak to us from Spain. It's a little later in Spain. And Aránzazu Guillán, Senior Officer of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN, will share some points with us. Thank you, Jaime, for your presentation. Thank you to our colleagues, friends who are joining us from Latin America.
All the auditors joining from Zambia and other countries in AFROSAI. Es un placer participar en el taller de cierre de esta auditoría.
It is a pleasure to participate in this overview of the audit work on environmental liabilities, and I thank you for your collaboration. I'd like to thank the Comptroller General's Office of Chile and also the GIZ for their support on this work. I'd like to share my screen. Allow me a few seconds to see if this works. There we are. It's very important to stress that this work was carried out within the context of the SDGs, and especially SDGs 2.4 and 2.3. And what Benjamin just showed us is that there is a huge gap in that graph that he showed us in the implementation and follow-up of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So I would like to share today some reflections on the applications of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs on mining environmental liabilities, and how this coordinated audit, this work that everyone has been carrying out these months, can further contribute to articulate some key messages that are key to strengthen the implementation of the SDGs in respect to mining environmental liabilities.
In this regard, and on the 2030 agenda, there's certainly a number of aspects here. And of course, I'm sure you are all familiar with this. But as we all know, the agenda is one that is international, but it has to be integrated locally. So we have to include the SDGs in our planning processes as well as our sectoral processes, considering a number of different contexts, and we have to identify goals that are associated with to develop targets that are associated with the goals. So this has to do with the environmental, social, and other aspects, as well as the integration in terms of coordination, cogencies of the different public policies. It is an inclusive, participatory effort. Benjamin has, of course, noted the importance there of the mining liabilities, but it is an agenda that's also focused on individuals, on peoples seeking to overcome inequalities and to ensure support for the most vulnerable. There are two important aspects that are novel here: the importance of institutions that are recognized in SDG 16, but as a cross-cutting element for the implementation of all of the SDGs. And unlike other previous frameworks, The 2030 agenda also identifies a system for the review and monitoring, including a global framework of indicators to be able to share lessons learned. That is to say, national governments must evaluate and review and report on their progress nationally. Now, why are all of these features important for the audits associated with this particular agenda, and specifically those of environmental liabilities and those stemming from mining? First of all, because there are a number of different programs, entities, multiple goals, and targets. We can see that through a number of different impacts, all of the SDGs are really very much important in mining and to extractive industries in general. Here we can see a number of priorities for mining specifically in two dimensions. First, the importance of the different targets within the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the positive impacts and the opportunities for mitigation of the negative impacts. We can see a focus here on two specific targets, as we can see on the chart, that have an indirect or a moderately direct impact. In terms of the negative impact, again, as has been mentioned previously, we're talking here not only about correcting issues, but also so that we can do early warning and do risk assessment to be better prepared. It is important to consider that when we select some of these targets, we...
Perdón, Aránzazu.
Sí.
No se está viendo.
Aránzazu, I'm so sorry. We're not able to see your screen. I apologize for the interruption, but perhaps we can continue and then I can show it. I think that will be easier and more effective in terms of time. As I was saying, then we have to consider the interaction between the different targets within the context of the SDGs. But there are also a multiplicity of targets, or rather of frameworks, globally and regionally, for example, in chemical waste and others that are important in the oversight of environmental liabilities. We have to see how these different frameworks and regulations interact. We also have multiple jurisdictions and a multiplicity of entities. We're not talking just about auditing the national mining institution in our given countries, but a wide range of institutions responsible for the governance that requires cooperation and collaboration. We can see in terms of government, again, the topic is of the utmost importance, particularly in extractive industries. And speaking of governance, the sector has very complex governance in terms of extractive industries, particularly given this relative balance between the public sector and the private sector that can vary, of course, in different domestic contexts. And this also affects the regulatory and the oversight abilities of the public and private sectors, as well as the incentives to the private sector that are given in each country. Therefore, the governance is complex, it is a network, and therefore has a number of different challenges. But these challenges are even greater if we consider the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, that of course start as of 2016. In an ideal world, the countries would look at the implementation of SDGs and would incorporate them into existing systems, both for planning over the long term as well as their sectoral efforts. However, in practice, what we see is this integration of the SDGs has a number of different challenges that are linked to existing challenges associated with the extractive industries and their governance. There are therefore a number of challenges, both in terms of the sector as well as the integration of the SDGs. Let me highlight some of these areas that we've identified recently and some of the work that we've done. If we look just at the extractive industries, we can see very often there are a multiplicity of non-aligned regulatory frameworks. The governance mechanisms predate the SDGs and have not necessarily been updated to be aligned with them. There are issues in terms of weak interjurisdictional coordination. The risk management systems are often weak or insufficiently developed. We have problems with information and data generation, as well as limited application of impact assessment or analysis methods. In many countries, regulation, supervision, and oversight by the public sector does not correct imbalances in the relationship between the private and public actors, and we have no sustainability reporting. If we look at the other side in terms of the integration of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, we can also see that there is weak intersectoral coordination in the governance agenda in many countries. Sector and policy objectives are not aligned with the SDGs. They lack target identification, and the monitoring systems do not allow for tracking processes to move toward the global SDG targets. Fourth, there's a lack of national indicators and the problems of data availability and quality, as well as coordination of data. We also see limitations in identifying the contribution of sectoral results to progress on SDG targets, and the integration of SDG monitoring, tracking, and review systems with sectoral monitoring or performance management systems is often problematic. This incomplete process of the integration of SDGs regionally and nationally also since last year, of course, has been hard hit by this tremendous crisis that we are all experiencing in all of our countries. The pandemic has had a tremendous impact on countries' socioeconomic development and therefore on the progress in terms of securing the SDGs. In the case of Latin America, the immediate impact is very clear. And of course, this will affect the capabilities for recovery across the region. There's been a very sharp contraction in GDP across the region of 7.7%, an expansion in the number of people living in extreme poverty, an uptick in unemployment, which was 13.5% at the end of 2020, with very high levels of informality. And the fiscal space also in terms of public revenue has dropped. This has led, of course, to issues in terms of thinking about recovery. Our public debt was 53.4% on average of GDP at the end of 2020, and the backsliding in public revenue was 13.6% of GDP, again, on average. Therefore, the question that we must pose here is, does it still make sense to talk about the SDGs? Are they still salient? Can we still reach these goals and targets? What purpose does this agenda have for us today? And in this regard, I'd like to send a very clear message to all of our teams. First, we cannot think about solving the health crisis first and then going back to the SDGs. The two things are intimately linked. We can look at the SDGs in the context of the pandemic, and the pandemic in the context of the SDGs. And we need to do so. Equally, the success that we have in implementing the agenda and in reaching the SDGs will also be closely linked to the type of response that we are giving to the crisis and the recovery plans and the building back better that we have into the future. In Latin America in general, the region is not starting in good stead. The countries that had made the most progress in SDGs also, of course, are better poised to do an analysis. But in any case, we can see, according to ECLAC, the situation in 2020, looking at 72 goals, was not very optimistic, was not very favorable. 4 had been reached, 15 were making progress, but the rest were in trouble. They were stalled in 27, we saw backsliding in 5, and 21 required further efforts by the public sector to make progress. In the case of the goals under consideration in this audit is really one of the biggest challenges is a lack of data that's available regionally. This makes it hard to understand where we stood and where we stand and what the impact of the pandemic may be on these countries. The lack of national goals and targets nationally also has been an issue. Now, I hope you can now see the chart, but if we look at 2 of these targets, we can see in the targets 12.4 and 15.3, we can see that in both of these cases, Latin America and the Caribbean were in a situation that was slightly above world average, especially with regard to 15.3.1 and 12.4.1. Now, what might be the impact of the pandemic? Of course, it can exacerbate deficiencies and gaps, but this can particularly happen in terms of the governance sectorally in this particular case of extractive industries and specifically mining. I think there's been a changing in priorities in many countries. Of course, this is leading to new environmental risks in terms of deregulation in many areas, reallocation of assets and resources, new environmental risks. In general, we've also seen institutional coordination entities or mechanisms that are not operational or focused on other tasks. The pandemic has also affected our data collection and information collection and sharing processes, and therefore affected the mid and long-term monitoring and oversight possibilities. This, again, weakens oversight. And of course, extractive industry operations also have an impact on public resources and may relegate sustainability in recovery in terms of market effects and disruptions. We also see tensions in fiscal regimes that can expand imbalances and threaten sustainable recovery. We've also seen, again, these tensions expanding and continuing between the public and private sectors, which therefore also threatens, as I said, our more sustainable recovery. I think it's important to highlight, despite all of these challenges, all of these issues, that the 2030 agenda should continue to be our guiding light for overcoming this crisis, for defining our measures and our recovery plans and programs. In that regard, the SIAs have a very important role to play. I believe that in this oversight and the response to the emergency, they have a very important role, of course, to play, as they do in follow-on of the 2030 agenda over the long term, as has been articulated within the context of UNDESA. And we can see how they are called upon to play a key role for transparency and accountability in the implementation of the SDGs.
I believe it would be desirable for this coordinated work to continue in the future because it offers information and evidence on the implementation of the SDGs at a national level, its causes, and it allows us to evaluate how we're using and managing public resources to support the implementation of the agenda, and it allows us to also analyze the performance of public programs to implement the SDGs. Through these audits, SDGs can carry out a sustainable recovery, and instruments for planning, long-term planning can be elaborated, the necessary incentives can be generated, there can be a better alignment between programs and mechanisms for refinancing, and also to assess the integral nature of public policies, the mechanisms for coordination between the different institutions, to analyze the public changes and how they are effective and the trajectory of implementation of the SDGs in each country. Also to examine the impact on vulnerable populations, and to stress governance as key elements that need to allow for sustainable recovery. The audit is going to offer very valuable recommendations, and the national reports can articulate important messages to strengthen the sustainability in this integral coordination of mining environmental liabilities and the opportunities to work on other specific aspects. I'd like to stress 4 areas. On one hand, it's important to articulate key messages regarding the governance structures and the need to have regulatory frameworks that are solid, sound, that would define responsibilities clearly, or accountability clearly, but beyond that, the processes and necessary resources for adequate functioning of these entities, and there needs to be good coordination between them. Key messages regarding the importance of having national objectives. Apart from the SDGs, they need to articulate this long-term perspective, this vision of the global agenda, but it also needs to include starting points for each local context. They must also include the meeting of these objectives at a regional level. Something that is very important is the importance of monitoring systems in order to inform decision-making and to adjust the national mechanisms to strengthen the learning experiences of public institutions and also for the citizens' accountability. Finally, to conclude, risk management programs are very important, not only to correct and mitigate the risks produced, but also the early alert systems that allow us to identify and prevent other potential risks for the population, for the environment. It's important to have a clear message for possible negative impacts in more vulnerable communities that are sometimes the ones that suffer the negative impacts of extractive industry activities. I am certain that these sessions, these next few days, are going to be very fruitful. They will allow strengthening the reports and clearly articulating many of these ideas. And of course, on our side, we remain at your disposal to help you achieve the results of this work in the next few months. Thank you. Thank you, Aránzazu. We know that it is late in Spain, where you find yourself now. And in fact, you mentioned a couple of things that are clearly reflected in the preliminary results of this audit, and they catch your attention. The lack of development of the SDGs, and in fact, the idea that some governments don't recognize the application of SDGs, such as in mining environmental liabilities or extractive industries, puts this and reflects the lack of of attention to this matter. And it's important to include the SDGs because they help us prioritize on these matters, especially in times of this pandemic. This allows us to promote their implementation and to remind auditors that are listening to us about the importance of this mission that we have as Supreme Audit institutions to move forward and to advance the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda, which actually offer us a response to addressing mining environmental liabilities and others. We will be discussing this in depth these days, and given the lack of development that we've observed. We don't have any questions. I would like to remind all of you that we have a Q&A session, and we can send questions to our panelists on the topics that have already been discussed, and we can send them the questions in case there are any doubts left with you. Continuing with our very tight agenda, I'd like to thank the presence of Ms. Grace Muchinga, Assistant Director of the Office of the Auditor General in Zambia. It is also very late there. It is 6 p.m. Who is representing the emphasized working group on the audit extractive industries, WGI, who will offer us an overview of the audit work performed on environmental liabilities. We'd like to remind you that we also have interpreting, and you can activate it at the bottom of your screen. Ms. Grace Muchinga, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation to give a presentation today. We sincerely apologize for network here, this side, but without wasting so much of the time, I think the introduction has already been given. In addition to being the Assistant Director Revenue, I'm also a component leader, extractive industries. And I think I'll quickly go ahead and give a presentation because of the network. Thank you. Next. Thank you. My presentation today is just to give an overview of audit work on environmental liabilities that has been done by the working group. I'll continue with the presentation. In this presentation, I'm giving you the outline, and I'll start with the first one, which is the objectives. And in the objectives, we are going to move the expectations from the characteristics of the extractive industries, and also the background. I'm going to look at the working abilities, and I'll take you the Vision 2030, challenges of auditing in the COVID-19. In addition, I'll also look at the challenges of auditing the environmental liabilities, and thereafter conclude my presentation. In the objectives, the first thing that we want to do is, in my presentation, want to see that participants comprehend the defining parameters, main characteristics of EI, as well as how the WIGA was established. In addition to that, we want to establish or to appreciate the work of the working group, especially around the audit of environmental liabilities. And we'll look at the appreciation of the SDGs from the extractive industry perspective. This, I'm not going to dwell too much on it because I saw the other presenter was just looking at the SDGs, but we'll look at what WIGA has done so far in relation to the SDGs achievement. And then we also talk about
Grace, we're experiencing some trouble. Maybe if you can shut down your camera, we'll be able to hear you properly. We hope so. Que la conexión de nuestra colega del grupo de trabajo se cortó.
Unfortunately, our colleague's connection has been lost.
Estamos con unos problemas técnicos en estos momentos, estamos tratando de solucionarlos, les pedimos paciencia.
We have a few technical issues. We would request that our participants, the attendees, be a little patient. The connection is it's experiencing some difficulties.
Nos informan que están con problemas de blackout en Zambia en estos momentos. Estamos tratando de restablecer las conexiones.
It appears that there is a blackout in Zambia at this time. We are seeking to reestablish the connection.
Grace, you're there. Can you hear us?
I think we seem to have a problem with the network. So we are asking to be given the opportunity to present it because we have a few things that we need to elaborate on our presentation. The network is not good for us here today.
Okay, so do you rather continue on Friday or?
Yes, I think we are appealing if you can give us a slot, like you have said on Friday, that is fine to enable us do a good presentation. For now, I think the network has been bad, in particular today. Our IT team are working extremely hard to ensure that everything is normal by the end of the day. So
we appreciate all your efforts. Thank you so much to the working group. Then we'll hear from you and from Mr. Charles on Friday, if that's okay. And we hope everything will turn out perfectly on that day. It sounded really interesting, your presentation. So thank you for that. Now I give the floor back to Jaime.
thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Muchísimas gracias. Agradecemos la presencia de Mrs.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the presence of this working group. We know the technical issues that Ms. Lushinga and her team are confronting, and we are, of course, deeply saddened to not have been able to hear their remarks today. Of course, we will adjust the schedule for Friday and invite you to join us then, when we will be having the closing remarks on this workshop that will, of course, include the participation of the WGEI and other panelists from other countries. It will, of course, then be an even more interesting event that will be strengthened by these remarks as a result of this presentation. We will endeavor to ensure that things go smoothly then. So we thank all of you who have joined us during this opening webinar. We invite you then most cordially to join us on Friday, April 30th at 11 a.m. Chile time, GMT -4, when we will be holding a closing seminar open to the public for all SAIs with presentations, as I've noted, with a representation rather from the WGEI of Zambia, the WGEA from Finland, the CAF of Canada, and others. The programs and the links are published on the website of the Office of the Comptroller General of Chile, OLACEFS, and the working group on public works of OLACEFS. We look forward to your presence and your participation. Now, following this session, the auditors will continue their work on the appropriate platform. And then, of course, on Friday, we will be able to share some of the results of that work. I wish you a very good week, and this will conclude this opening session. Again, we apologize for the technical issues. If there are any questions that have not been resolved here, as an organization, we will reach out to you and to the panelists to be able to share your concerns. There are, it appears, a few questions that we can answer now, but at this juncture, we will conclude our streaming and wrap up this session. Thank you all for joining us.